I'm sure it's not so controversial to say that at least once in most of your lives, you have felt like you were surrounded by mouth-breathing idiots. At least once, you may have pondered to yourself how the world came to function when it is polluted by unconscious automatons, incapable of self-reflection, stumbling forward through life, whereas you are granted the gift or curse of seeing people for who they truly are. The common folk worship celebrities that offer little beyond their superficial qualities. The politically minded cling to political parties that have already sufficiently demonstrated their eternal incompetence. The extroverted discuss petty gossip rather than ideas. And somehow, either by God's providence or spite, only you have this acute perception. If you fancy yourself a humanist and have rarely experienced this mindset, I ask you to consider what it might be like to possess this hyperconscious mindset all the time. To see every fault in a person or concept long before the average human, and to exploit that fault in order to exalt your quote-unquote intelligence. And not only is this perception directed outward, but inward at your every potentiality. Before you can fully develop a thought or action, you foresee every possible fault, flaw, and failure, and moreover, you measure the devastation that failure will wreak upon your already fragile psyche. Given these circumstances, in the mind of the hyperconscious man or woman, the only possible outcome is to do nothing but direct your perceptions at the outer world, exploit the weakness in others, and bring them down to your wretched, miserable level. In the last minute or so, I have described two types of character. One, the average internet troll, and two, the lead character of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Published in 1864, this 100-page novella tells the story of a nameless man living with an oversaturated consciousness. Though he is a troll, pathetic in his inertia and vicious in his words and actions, he is nonetheless an anti-hero rather than a villain. For his hyperconsciousness leads him to profound realizations about human nature, just as much as it leads him to violent verbal dissection of those who displease him. In order to help you, the viewer, enjoy this video to the fullest, I have left time codes in the description box so you can skip to desired sections and TLDRs. I will now briefly give a synopsis of the book for those who have not read it, but feel free to skip ahead if you have. The first part of the book are the thoughts and musings of a nameless narrator, which we shall refer to as the Underground Man. The first lines of the book establish the wretched mindset of the Underground Man and the pessimistic tone for the rest of the book. Quote, "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I think my liver is diseased." The main character's self-assessment arises from his self-diagnosis of overacute consciousness. As I established in the opening of this video, our main character overzealously studies and analyzes his every thought and sense perception. Though this hyperdeveloped perception makes him unbelievably intelligent in some respects, he falls prey to the impulse of criticizing every weakness in himself and others. His unique level of consciousness leads him to inertia, that is, conscious sitting with the hands folded. Think about it this way. Imagine if somebody wronged you and you wanted revenge. Is your desire for revenge justified? Even if your desire is justified, is the act itself moral? Would you cause yourself more pain in carrying out your revenge? Would the pain you feel ever match what you could possibly inflict on the person who supposedly wronged you? Was that person's misdeed really that offensive? Was it a misdeed at all? These types of questions multiply ad nauseum in the mind of the Underground Man so that he never actually commits to carrying out any action, but rather thinks himself into an existential paralysis, like one of T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men. For the first 50 pages of this book, his rumination is applied to basic things, like his fellow man or his city of St. Petersburg, but also to dense philosophical concepts like utopianism and free will. We will get into the specifics of these thoughts following the summary. The vast majority of this video will focus on the first part of the book, seeing that consensus dictates it has the most valuable content. Quickly, however, I'll summarize the remainder. The second part of the book moves from the Underground Man's personal notes to three specific events from his life. The first story involves the man's obsession with an officer who usually passes by him on the street but never notices him. He goes to great lengths to get his attention, going so far as to buy a coat with money he doesn't have and bump into the officer while wearing it. This is his perverse way of trying to gain the respect he believes he deserves from people he believes he should be equal or superior to. Despite his efforts, he is persistently ignored. The second story involves the underground man at a dinner party with some of his old peers from school. He does not like the people at this dinner party because he views their minds and tastes as underdeveloped, but goes anyways so that he might have an outlet for his spite. Naturally, the party ends disastrously for the miserable troll, having insulted everybody present. The third story picks up shortly after the second, as we see the underground man lying in bed next to a prostitute named Lisa. Because of Lisa's economic and moral status, the underground man sees an opportunity to assert his dominance. He vividly describes the hopelessness of Lisa's future, which drives her to an anxiety attack, wailing and thrashing about. Yet perversely, the underground man's criticism leads her to believe that maybe he could help her. If he understands her situation so well, maybe he could point her in the right direction. However, to summarize, the underground man cannot do so, as a consequence of his state of mind which only permits him to deconstruct and destroy, rather than build and foster. When Lisa realizes this fact, she leaves him to waste away in dust and ashes. The underground man's condition leads him to believe that every sort of consciousness, in fact, is a disease. Picture this. You are able to see every possible consequence, positive or negative, to every thought or action that crosses your mind. Moreover, your acute consciousness makes you perceive the true joy and/or devastation if you were to carry out an action. Instead of enduring the greatest of potential lows, you crawl into a corner until your mind stops swarming with these opposite elements. What becomes worse is when those thoughts concern your own personal worth. The underground man, though he considers himself cleverer than any of the people surrounding him, and derives a sense of self-worth from that, nevertheless, he feels positively ashamed of it. Imagine you were hyper-conscious of your faults. You're too fat or too thin, too uneducated or overeducated, too antisocial or so overly social that you neglect more important matters. Everybody in this world has a lot of self-improvement that they neglect on account of its difficulty. To be this conscious of one's weaknesses would foster a sort of existential paralysis, where, much like the underground man, you retreat into a dark corner and brood. To be in that state because of your cleverness is truly shameful. This is where the reader finds utility in the underground man's perception. Though he uses the fruits of his perception to degrade others and himself, the fruits are nonetheless powerful truths. Let's go back to the previous example of enacting revenge on somebody who wronged you. As we established with the underground man, he would be too consumed by the potential negative consequences of revenge. In the case of the average man, is it wrong to assume that they might skip the contemplation and dash straight for his object like an infuriated bull with its horns down and nothing but a wall to stop him? Is it reasonable to consider this particular average man to be stupid? Though the underground man is pathetic with his inertia, who has the moral high ground between him and the average man? Well, one might argue that the underground man is morally superior, for through his innate stupidity, the average man looks upon his revenge as justice pure and simple, while in a consequence of his acute consciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it. The underground man's choice to not enact revenge, though he desperately wants it, is commendable. Yet, given the fact that he's a walking contradiction, the underground man envies the average man till he is green in the face. Despite the underground man's moral victory, he is left with so many other nastinesses in the form of doubts and questions that there inevitably works up around it a sort of fatal brew, a stinking mess, made up of its doubts, emotions, and of the contempt spat upon it by the direct men of action who stand solemnly about it as judges and arbitrators, laughing at it till their healthy sides ache. In other words, the underground man sees himself as the bullied schoolboy, whose attackers are too stupid to see the innate cruelty in their actions. The profundity of the underground man's philosophy does not stop there. He applies his contempt for his acute consciousness and the average man by combining it with popular philosophical quandaries of the time. Around 1864, ideas of utopianism, free from religious influence and based purely on rational morality, began to emerge. The works of Karl Marx, for instance, promoted the communist utopia, where all would contribute according to their ability and all would receive in accordance with one's need. In his resentment toward the normal human condition, the underground man makes a powerful argument to discredit any enthusiasm for utopia, and it all rests on one question. Why should we assume that people would always act rationally in their own self-interest? This is a quote from Chapter 7, Part 1. What is to be done with the millions of facts that bear witness that men, consciously, that is, fully understanding their real interests, have left them in the background and have rushed headlong on another path, to meet peril and danger, compelled to this course by nobody and by nothing, but, as it were, simply disliking the beaten track, and have obstinately, willfully, struck out another difficult, absurd way, seeking it almost in the darkness. Only look about you. Blood is being spilt in streams, and in the merriest way, as though it were champagne. Take the whole of the 19th century in which Buckle lived. Take Napoleon, the Great, and also the present one. Take North America, the Eternal Union. Take the farce of Schleswig-Holstein, and what is it that civilization softens in us? The only gain of civilization for mankind is the greater capacity for variety of sensations, and absolutely nothing more. And through the development of this many-sidedness, man may come to finding enjoyment in bloodshed. In any case, civilization has made mankind, if not more bloodthirsty, at least more vilely, more loathsomely bloodthirsty. In old days, he saw justice in bloodshed, and with his conscience at peace exterminated those he thought proper. Though the underground man sees reason as an excellent thing, it satisfies only the rational side of human nature, ignoring the power of man's irrational impulses. It is through the underground man's recognition of humanity's inherent irrationality that Dostoevsky makes his most profound statement. Though the concept of a moral system based on rationality and not religion sounds wonderful, there is the problem of free will. Do human beings have free will? Well, there are powerful arguments from both sides of the aisle. If we don't have free will and we live in a determinist universe, there will nevertheless be human beings that could not accept that truth, and do everything they can to prove that they do, in fact, have free will. Even if everything in this universe was perfectly to their liking, so they had no excuse to be unhappy, they would purposefully destroy their surroundings in order for something new and interesting to happen, while simultaneously asserting their free will. Here's a quote from Chapter 8. Shower upon him every earthly blessing. Drown him in a sea of happiness so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men still are men, and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposefully do something perverse out of simple ingratitude, simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive sufferings of all sorts, only to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between him and other animals. Maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object, that is, convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you say that all this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. This is one of the most profound statements I have ever read, and it was spoken by a character marred with insecurities and spite. It is humanity's tendency towards irrationality that shall eternally inconvenience the secularists and utopian dreamers. By no means am I making a final statement on the existence of free will, because, as I said, there are powerful arguments for and against, but nonetheless, Dostoevsky's vicarious declaration sticks in one's throat whenever the subject comes up in conversation. The truths laden in the underground man's musings, while brilliant, nonetheless paint a bleak picture of both humanity and reality. If human beings are doomed to irrationality, lacking in consciousness and self-reflection, the products of these negative traits will forever produce relentless tragedy. This realization is bound to have depressive effects, as it did for the brooding underground man. In the modern era, I have found this to be the case for the average internet troll. In my time online, I have found trolls to be very sophisticated in their analysis and cruelty, finding your greatest weaknesses and exploiting it over days, weeks, even months. Much like the underground man, they probably find themselves alone in their room, nihilistic about existence and their future prospects, and so they find the meaning they so desperately need in degrading people online. I understand them. The feeling that all of their productive efforts are in vain and done for people who are undeserving and ungrateful. I understand their own utopian idealism, how they feel radical measures would correct reality's inherent corruption. Unlike the average troll or the underground man, I have realized that there is dignity and meaning in one's suffering, on accepting reality as it is, and being a positive influence in the lives of others. That choosing not to give in to nihilism's corrupting influence commands respect, and sustains our fellow man through life's trials. To an extent, even the underground man realizes this, with one of his final statements. Which is better, cheap happiness or exalted sufferings? Well, which is better?